Almost 18 months have passed since the UK government launched its long-awaited integrated review of defence and security policy with its accompanying command paper from the MOD. And so much has happened in that time, most significantly the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with the worst armed conflict in Europe since the Second World War, laying bare a stark new challenge to the UK and its allies. So how relevant are the IR and command paper today? And what changes are needed to deal with harsh modern reality? With me, Ben Vogel, to discuss this and other questions is General Sir Richard Barrons, former head of Joint Forces Command and now co-chairman of the consultancy Universal Defence and Security Solutions. General, welcome to the Shephard Defence podcast.
Hello.
So let's get going and look back to 2021 when the IR and the command paper were released. I mean, would you describe those as being the right documents at the right time?
I think at the time that they were published, and we should remind ourselves that they were the result of a lot of work across government. They did an appropriate job of beginning to define how the world was changing, how more threatening it was going to be to the UK in terms of its values, its security, and its prosperity. And it began to articulate a coherent approach to dealing with this world. But I think even at the time, it understated the resources that were going to be necessary to manage this new world. And it definitely, and no one would have expected it to capture the effect that the war in Ukraine and the developing concern over Taiwan would have on what we must now do for our defence and security.
I know you've said in the past, and I did a bit of research and looked up a webinar that you appeared in. You mentioned something about every single defence review since the 1990s has fallen short, and that the integrated review risks seizing catastrophe from the jaws of triumph, which is a very evocative phrase. You were saying that last year, and obviously with everything that's been going on that we've been talking about, such as Ukraine, arguably those feelings are just as true today.
Yes, they are. And we should remind ourselves that every defence review has failed because it has, in each case, articulated a difficult world and listed the things that need to be done, and then consistently not provided, in some cases, the direction and certainly not the resources to meet the scale of the challenge that has just been articulated. In the case of the integrated review of 2021, it did a better job of describing a different world, but it stopped short, really, of, I think, of grasping the degree of existential risk that the UK and our allies now face. And even in 2021, it didn't deliver the resources in defence alone to either put right what is currently adrift, and definitely not to expedite the changes that need to happen in terms of size and technology and training.
But there are certain aspects of both documents, the IR and command paper, which do appear to have addressed certain issues correctly or semi-correctly. Is that fair to say? I mean, can we try to accentuate the positive, or is it worth accentuating the positive in this particular context?
Yes, there were many aspects in the rhetoric, particularly at the front end of the integrated review, that really did begin to capture how the post-Cold War era, which has been very comfortable for the West, has now definitively concluded, and that what we're now facing is a very different multipolar world dominated over time by the very difficult combination of the rise of China in whatever form that takes, concurrent with the global perils arising from population growth and climate change in terms of the instability that provokes, concurrent with the dislocation of the digital age in the way that it is changing, not just how we live, work and play, but also how we confront and how we fight, plus the failure to contain the proliferation of nuclear weapons as we now ascend into a world which is, I think, increasingly characterized as a clash between liberal democracy, which is no longer going to be preeminent in a world by some sort of divine right, and autocratic capitalism, which in the eyes of many in the world is proving to be more resilient and more successful in the face of the challenges I have described. And in this environment, the integrated review said we were heading down this road, but it then articulated some very general and in some cases rather tokenistic approaches to it, which I think the events of 2022 in Ukraine and in the South China Sea are exposing as simply not enough.
I mean, given the sheer complexity of the different multifaceted issues that you've just mentioned, General, I think it's is it possible to defend the authors of both documents by saying it's almost impossible to capture and encapsulate a doctrinally coherent strategy in the face of all these various multifaceted problems?
I think the authors did a very good job of beginning to say how different this world is going to be. I think they stopped short, perhaps because their employers made them stop short of exposing just what a degree of existential challenge this world might present to the UK. And when it came to the second part of the report, in listing the resources that were going to be applied, particularly to transforming our defence and security, there was nothing like the resources made available to meet the scale of challenge that was described even in the integrated review, and definitely not in the face of current global offence. So I give the authors many plaudits for having the courage to articulate the change in direction, but the documents as a whole, for whatever reason, fall short of the blueprint that we now need.
Okay, and you mentioned that the IR command paper addressed issues in a certain tokenistic fashion. Are there any signs of that kind of tokenism changing or a lesson being learned in the period since the publication of the IR, given the challenges presented by Ukraine and China today?
So I think in the way the world has turned out in 2022, events have acted as a massive accelerant of the sorts of changes that we were beginning to move towards, in my view, rather gently and over too long a timescale. I mean, the war in Ukraine, to take an example, has illustrated to us very powerfully what war in the 21st century really looks like, both in the ways that it's different from the conventional war that we perhaps last saw in the Cold War, and the ways that it is actually the same when you're fighting for territory. And to some degree, we might not have also have foreseen the parallel movement in NATO to articulate the imperative to transition from what was essentially a fairly cheap and gentle policy of deterrence by punishment, heavily reliant on the nuclear deterrent, to where we are now clearly having to go, whether we want to or not, into restoring deterrence by denial, with all the different posture and costs that come with that. So 2022 is acting as an accelerant of the sort of direction the integrated review hinted at, but did not fully grasp. And perhaps it would have been too much to ask that it did actually grasp it.
Indeed, as you've just said, we seem to be returning to an era where, to put it simplistically, perhaps a higher army headcount is required, which would be exactly the opposite of the intention in the integrated review, which foresaw a lower British Army headcount back to the era of the Napoleonic Wars, according to some estimates. Are we still looking at a situation where technology can be applied by the MOD to substitute for a lack of manpower?
I think it's clear that in the 30 years or so since the end of the Cold War, we have established there are areas where better technology means that you do not need to rely so heavily on very large numbers of people. But we have also established, and the war in Ukraine has clearly illustrated, that isn't a total panacea. That's not going to be the answer to every question. And now we recognize, I think, some important things. First of all, based on the war in Ukraine, that mass matters. Because we're no longer setting about the sorts of interventions that it might have been characterized as discretionary, the sort of thing that we executed in Iraq and Afghanistan. We're now back to deterrence by denial, which requires bigger forces at higher readiness in different geography with greater endurance. And in there, technology will provide some of the answer, might come back to that, but not all of it. So we are going to have to restore mass. In terms of how technology can restore mass, it will be through the evolution of armies, navies, and air forces into a manned, unmanned, and increasingly autonomous mix. All of those things enabled by the digital age in a process that will run over decades and is only just getting going. So because it is an evolutionary process over the long term, the savings in manpower are likely to come later. And right now, we should accept that if we had armed forces that were built for the world that we called Cold War, they're not going to be sufficient for the world we're in now, which is better characterized as pre-war in some way that's very difficult to define.
That pre-war phrase is a very interesting one. I think that's something that I'd like to return to later in the conversation. We're talking about how the army should be building up its forces in the future, in terms of how it should be procuring new platforms in the future in order to sort of effectively deter potential enemies, as well as fight on the battlefield effectively. Is it fair to say that the MOD has fallen short, particularly in terms of well-known fiascos such as Ajax and Warrior? I mean, you've served in the army for many years. You've worked with the MOD for many years, General. Why is the MOD getting it so wrong? And what is the solution, in your opinion?
So I think the place to start in what is a very complex problem is to recognize that the British Army of today now has to execute at speed and at scale the most profound transformation of itself for about 100 years. And it's not particularly helpful to devote all the debate to the numbers of regular soldiers, because what we're actually talking about is a reconstruction of the army for war in the 21st century. And let me put some flesh on that. So we used to conceive of an army that was essentially built around the tank, supported by armored infantry, artillery, and engineers. And over the last 30 years, that has diminished as the army has essentially been committed to a series of lighter counterinsurgency tasks. But the things that the army relied on heavily in the Second World War and in the Cold War, so for example, comprehensive air defense and very powerful long-range weapons, all of those things were much diminished. And the army of today is inverting itself into something that begins with its capacity for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, connected by digital age command and control systems to increasingly long-range precision fires with the maneuver element, 21st century armor, which will include tanks and infantry under armor, but in a different way, playing much more of a supporting role to the way that digital technology allows the army to achieve its objectives as it evolves into this manned, unmanned, and autonomous mix. And in that transformation, yes, of course, there will be demand for regular soldiers, but also a much bigger role for the reserves in a way that is historically, I think, more common in British military history. And of course, also supported by a resilient home base, including industry. We can no longer assume the army prepares at leisure at home and then sallies forth abroad before the war starts. The war starts in the homeland these days. So if you bundle all of that together, the transformation of the army is a lot more than about the number of people, but it is
Yeah.
also about its acquisition. And there are two perils here. One is that the MOD has not successfully done what ought to be a relatively straightforward job of procuring a modern armored vehicle. And secondly, the MOD and the Army and the services have got to learn to acquire digital age capability at the speed of development of digital age technology, and systems designed to acquire platforms at 30-year cycles just won't work for that. Now, they all know that. They're all capable of doing it, and now they need to be unlocked with policy and resources to do it.
That's right. I remember there was a lot of talk of agile procurement many years ago by the MOD and government. I'm not quite sure how far that was actually put into practice, or whether that was just a ministerial buzz phrase of the time.
So I think UK procurement has been in a state of flux for decades now, and it grapples with the pace of technology, and it grapples to find counterparts in industry that can balance commercial advantage with the requirement of public service to spend taxpayers' money wisely and in a very well-controlled environment. Nonetheless, we now have to find a way of the MOD partnering with industry in a way that is less transactional and more committed over time, perhaps with less competition, in order to develop technology, whether it is command and control technology or weapon systems or vehicles or whatever it is, in order to develop those things in a way that allows the armed forces to be equipped with the latest technology, not the technology that was the latest when the specification was frozen about 5 years before the thing was actually made.
Okay. You mentioned a couple of minutes ago that the war begins at home, and that's very interesting, because that underlines the importance of being able to wage sort of hybrid warfare, information war, to prevent cyber attacks on the UK as part of a kind of unified, holistic defence policy. So, in your opinion, General, is the UK prepared sufficiently to wage hybrid war?
So if we go back to the integrated review, it began to describe that there are three things in terms of defence and security that now have to be addressed in an integrated way. The first thing is the restoration of resilience. And in the terms of the UK homeland, that resilience has a physical dimension around infrastructure and the industrial base. It has a human dimension, the safety of the population and things like its food supply and water. It has a digital dimension. We all rely on our digital infrastructure for the sustainment of daily life and indeed almost anything that we do. And then there is a very important cognitive dimension to resilience, which is about having citizens that know how to respond when the water isn't coming out of the tap and we are locked in a confrontation. This is something that every citizen has a part to play, and it's not something the government is going to fix on the spot for everybody. And then, of course, the accessibility of every adult mind in this country through their smartphone to information that an opponent might wish to give them. So resilience as a subject requires the sort of refreshment that will feel much like the emphasis put on resilience in the Second World War and the Cold War, updated for the modern age, but absolutely new territory for most adults in the country today. And the second aspect is the recognition that the UK is locked every day in a confrontation, which you can describe as hybrid or grey space or tolerance warfare, where states that do not have our best interests at heart are using all the levers of power that they have to disrupt us or disturb us or even damage us, whether that's through offensive cyber or their use of money or proxies or politics or sanctions or anything that they can reach for. And the autocracies confronting the UK, such as Russia and China, find that easier to do than democracies do, because democracies struggle to bring together the public sector levers of power with the private sector levers of power. So we have to learn to do hybrid confrontation as campaigns, not event management. And there are very few people serving as politicians or officials or even armed forces officers today that have really had the educational training to be able to do that. So we're going to have to provide it. And then the third dimension after resilience and hybrid campaigning is the transformation of military power to be fit for the digital age, which is about keeping some of the stuff that still works and introducing a lot of stuff that reflects that the world is now transparent, that precision weapons will dominate platforms and infrastructure, and data is everywhere, and space is now part of how you wage war and action short of war. So all of this new 21st century orchestra of war is the most profound transformation of defense for at least 100 years.
Given what you've just said, would you say that there's kind of lack of awareness in the UK of the need to be hybrid campaigners? Would you say that's one of the biggest capability gaps that we should be aware of now that perhaps we weren't aware of when the integrated review was being built?
So the integrated review does a pretty good job of describing this hybrid landscape. And the fusion doctrine issued by the government in March 2018 does the same sort of thing. It sets out the sorts of perils we face short of the use of military force and what needs to be done to be resilient and, if necessary, to play it back to others. What the UK has struggled to do is to build the authorities and the organisation and find the resources to put this on a well-orchestrated campaign footing. And some of this is about how Whitehall works in the way that departments come together in a way that is more than sort of collegiate cooperation. There is going to have to be a taught system of deciding on priorities and perhaps moving resources between departments and setting priorities than Whitehall generally likes to follow. And then there's the far bigger question, which is how does the government in the UK harness the greatest power that the UK has, which is in the private sector? Many people find the UK influential because of our banking, our insurance, our legal system, our property market, our culture, our sport, TV, and all these many other things. And in a difficult relationship in a hard world with countries like Russia and China and no doubt others, we have to find a way of harnessing that power to serve our national ends, or our enemies will think we're either weak or inconsistent because they have no difficulty in connecting their public and private sectors when they wish to influence us.
Given that MOD policy was looking at China in a big way, trying to sort of pivot towards the Asia Pacific region, and of course there was a carrier strike group deployment earlier in the year, very much, and last year, very much in that direction. Is that an example of a miscalculation necessarily by the MOD in that they weren't to know? Obviously, Russia would invade Ukraine, but it led some people to think that the UK had taken its eye off the ball in Eastern Europe by putting all its eggs, it seemed, in the Indo-Pacific basket. Is that a fair criticism, would you say?
So I think it's partly fair. I think we have recognized for some years now that a world where power used to be held in the West and flow from West to East is changing to a world where power will reside in the East and will generally flow to the West, particularly if we allow it to be so, just because of the numbers of people who will live in the East and the economic power, particularly of China, as it becomes the world's single largest economy. So it was reasonable for people to say in the run-up to the Ukraine war that we really need to pay more attention to the combination of the rise of China and the destabilizing effects of climate change and the way the digital age is uprooting not just industries and civil societies, but relationship between states. So the tilt to Asia Pacific, I think, still holds good for the Western world, but it is much more proximate to the US, given that it's a Pacific power, than it is for medium weight European powers that now find themselves confronted by an aggressive, ambitious, militaristic, and increasingly out of control Russia. So I think it is much more likely now that there will be a rebalancing through NATO to deal with the confrontation with Russia and to deal with the war in Ukraine. And that will mean there is less focus from Europe on what happens in Asia Pacific, but it will still matter to Europe given the trading relationship with China. And I guess the US will think it's a better idea if Europe sorts itself out and sorts Russia out to allow the US to put more effort on the key relationship with China. And so we'll see a rebalancing.
So you mentioned, General, how NATO is looking to kind of reorient itself to deal with this resurrected Russian threat. And indeed, after the Madrid summit a few weeks ago, there was a move to enhance the NATO rapid reaction or readiness force. In that kind of context, this requires perhaps a kind of rebalancing of the budget or a reallocation of certain UK MOD resources if the MOD is going to take greater role in participating in NATO deterrence. You personally, General, have described the UK defence budget as broken in the past. So I'm interested in your opinion of where we are at the moment and where we should be going in the future as far as defence spending is concerned. I know money isn't everything, but it's a pretty important factor.
So if we start with the state of the UK defence programme, we can explain very well where we are now, and we can plot a trajectory that starts really with the end of the Cold War in 1990 to the present day, where UK conventional armed forces have got smaller. They've have some extremely good equipment, but in ever smaller numbers and less visible to the public eye, also hollowed out in terms of the stocks on the shelves, the strength of the reserves, the industrial capacity to support a remobilization, the resilience of the home base. And why wouldn't we have been in that position in the absence of an existential threat, which we genuinely did not feel, I think, until about 2015, and then we became more alert to an aggressive Russia. On the other hand, if you look at what NATO has just said, and we are a leading NATO power, NATO has, in its strategic concept, identified that it has to deal not just with Russia, but with the NATO membership voice in a tricky world, perhaps dominated by the rise of China. That what we have managed with for a whole generation is not going to last. And in this transition from deterrence by punishment, essentially small trigger forces, the enhanced forward presence battle groups, and nuclear weapons that constitute deterrence by punishment, in articulating a return to deterrence by denial, which essentially means it's not going to be acceptable for Russia to actually invade and occupy territory in the way that it has in Ukraine. We are taking ourselves to a different place, which will require bigger forces at higher readiness in places like the Baltic states, and forces that can be made bigger quickly in an emergency, and if required to fight, have the resilience and endurance to outlast the opponents, with all the lessons that we're seeing from Ukraine. That is absolutely something that the current UK armed forces, land, sea and air, are incapable of doing, because we have neither asked them to do it nor equipped them to do it. So as we are now asking them to do it, they will have to be resourced, and that will mean filling in the holes in inventory, making the standing force bigger, buying it more equipment, connecting it to a stronger reserve, and building a resilient military and industrial homeland, or we will not be capable of deterrence by denial. And with that will come a bigger bill. at a profoundly difficult time, everyone accepts, for the public finances. And if you look at what Germany has done, spending 100 billion euros this year and moving up to spend 2% of GDP, it will eclipse the UK's spending. And it's a marker, well, if Germany is doing this, clearly that's where the rest of us are going to have to go.
And Germany isn't the only country as well. Poland, for instance, has embarked on a truly eye-watering expansion of its armed forces, which I suppose is understandable given its geographical location, but it's very much a sign of the times. It seems that percentage of GDP on defence across NATO has to increase.
Yes, it is. And when we do that, we need to deconflict time and timing, because right now the Russian military is heavily hollowed out and focused on what's going on in Ukraine. So, for example, the military threat to places like Estonia today is smaller. It's also not the point. The point is that the war in Ukraine, one way or another, will finish. And Russia is very likely then to reform and rearm its military in ways that are much more threatening. So the first thing we're going to do is to have to benchmark UK forces with NATO against a resurgent and reformed Russian military, not the poorly performing forces that we've seen of late. And secondly, when we do that, it won't just be about Russia. It will be about playing our part in an unstable world, which will be dominated by, I think, this clash between liberal democracy and autocratic capitalists, perhaps on a tableau created by the instability of climate change. So we're going to need forces that can stand up for the UK's interests with our friends almost anywhere in the world. And that, again, is not something that we have asked our armed forces to do at scale or endurance for a very long time.
So we are in a pretty dangerous situation if we need to ask the armed forces to perform missions with equipment that they don't have at the moment and that will take some time to invest in. I think I'd like to conclude, General, by just quoting a phrase that you used in a Global Strategy Forum webinar last year about describing a world which is so very challenging that it feels pre-war. And I think you used that phrase earlier in the conversation. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit? Because it does seem a fairly alarming phrase in many ways, because many people will turn their minds back to the 1930s. And indeed, General Sir Patrick Saunders at the recent Risi Land Conference talked about this being our 1937 moment. In other words, we need to rearm very quickly.
So we're used to using the expression the post-war, particularly post-Cold War. And we've had the joy since 1990 of living in a world where we didn't feel existential threat to the homeland in a way that our ancestors felt was, just normal for hundreds of years. And we're dealing with a legacy of that comfortable generation. But actually, as you look around the world now in the way that we have talked about, well, firstly, we're seeing a resurgent, aggressive and ambitious Russia, which isn't just Putin. It's Putin and at least 80 million Russians who think he's on the right course here, who look at the world in a very different way and do not wish us well. And that comes with some significant territorial ambitions, which would be at the expense of countries we're friendly with or NATO members, and is backed up by 6,000 nuclear weapons. There's not much post-war about that sentiment. And then beyond that, this multipolar world where there is no longer just the US as the single superpower. Indeed, we have a US which to some degree has become a bit more introverted and much more focused for obvious reasons, I think, on Asia Pacific. But we live in a world which is multipolar, where China is stepping up from biding its time to being the economic superpower with the political and military power that comes with its economic strength and an ambition which is clearly articulated as being almost by right the leading power on this earth. and then a whole raft of other countries, if you like, the global middle ground, which trying perhaps not to choose between the East and the West, but in some cases are choosing, and they're not necessarily choosing the West. So if we recognise that our security, our lives, our prosperity, our sense of ourselves and our values depends on being part of a globalized world, which we used to characterize as the rules-based international order, although whatever that is, it's going to be different. Then it is more likely than not that we are going to have to confront challenges that are very serious, and that too feels more pre-war than post-war. So if we frame our future currently as feeling pre-war, then we're likely to take better decisions about how we reset our defense and security, how we find money for it in preference to the many other things we would love to spend our money on. And we might also harden our minds and our hearts as citizens for a world that is not by some guarantee or right going to be beneficial to us unless we stand up for ourselves.
General Sir Richard Barrons, thank you very much.
Thank you.